Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It's Friday, June 16th, 2023. I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Tammy Ma. Tammy, it is wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
Tammy, to start, tell me please your title and institutional affiliation.
Sure. My current title, I actually have many, but one of them is the lead for the Inertial Fusion Energy Initiative here at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory.
Now, the lead means what? What are some of the scientific and administrative responsibilities you have in that role?
What it means right now is we are trying to grow a new program to apply the fusion research that we do towards the application of energy. And we'll probably go into it a little more during this talk, the different applications and why we are where we are right now. But my role right now is to bring our laboratory together, develop a science and technology roadmap for where we want to go, and then also work with the community externally as well to help grow a national program in inertial fusion energy.
Tammy, of course, Lawrence Livermore National Lab is a big place. Can you describe where this initiative sits organizationally, both within the National Ignition Facility and the overall lab?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, why we're calling it an initiative is it sits directly with the director. The director has chosen a couple of areas of potential growth for the laboratory, areas that get to leverage a lot of the different capabilities that we have across the laboratory that we actually see as a future path for the lab. And because we are a national security laboratory, all the work that we do is meant to be in the good of the nation, right? Science on a mission is actually, I think, our motto. And so we see inertial fusion energy as something that would be great for the country if we can make it happen. But it does require leadership. It requires focused effort to grow what that program should look like. And so that's why this program sits directly under, I shouldn't use the word, this initiative sits directly with the director. And then if we can grow it and actually bring in funding to do S&T research, bring in funding to do, other things, then we will figure out where it fits best within the overall structure of Lawrence Livermore.
Tammy, given the National Ignition Facility's leadership in stockpile stewardship and nuclear weapons safety, obviously without getting into any sensitive details, is the quest for nuclear fusion, does it have a national security component to it as well, or is this more a basic and applied science kind of environment?
Absolutely. It's very much both. So the National Ignition Facility is the world's largest, most energetic laser. And what we can do with it is actually generate conditions that you cannot generate elsewhere on Earth right now. And so we can create plasmas of very high temperatures, densities, pressures, in some cases similar to what you have inside nuclear weapons. And so that's why we can study those conditions at typically a very micro scale. And then use that science to validate our simulation codes. And these are the same codes that we may actually run to ensure the safety, security, and reliability of the nuclear stockpile. Because since 1992, in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, we have not done any underground nuclear testing in the U.S. Or anywhere in the world, actually. But because of that, we still have nuclear weapons in our arsenal. And so we need to ensure that, they are safe, they are secure. If, heaven forbid, we ever had to use them, they would work the first time, right? That is the deterrence. And so we use science to make sure that the stockpile is effective in the absence of nuclear testing. And so that's partially what the NIF is used for. We also do a bunch of fundamental science on the NIF. We actually open it up to academics around the world. Typical proposal review process, come up with an idea, you apply. What we can do is actually generate astrophysical phenomena in the laboratory and observe that instead of waiting for something to actually happen in the universe. And so all kinds of very cool science, We just explore plasmas in all kinds of different ways. And then it just turns out the same fusion plasmas that we generate for the stockpile stewardship mission are the exact same plasmas that form the basis of a clean energy source. And so it's a dual use technology, basically, which the national labs have a ton of expertise in, and this is another example.
Tammy, a question about collaboration. It's a worldwide effort, of course, to create nuclear fusion that involves academia, national governments, private enterprise. Is Lawrence Livermore's purview that it has capabilities where the creation of viable nuclear fusion energy can be an in-house proposition entirely? Or does Lawrence Livermore need those collaborations? Are there capabilities elsewhere that Livermore doesn't have?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It is a collaboration now, and it will definitely be a collaboration going forward. The overall challenge of realizing fusion energy, turning into a viable, economical energy source, turning it into power plants, is such a monumental challenge. There's so much development that needs to be done, both in the science, the fundamental science, and all types of engineering. We know we cannot do it alone. We absolutely need help from all different sectors, all different industries, national labs, universities, private industry, all of that coming together. But our role right now is, we achieved ignition on the NIF, right? We have a lot of the expertise that is needed to help lay the groundwork and define what a roadmap might look like. And so that's where the majority of our effort resides right now in terms of the fusion energy sphere.
As a matter of that collaboration, what does Livermore offer? What are its capabilities that make it unique in this worldwide effort?
Okay, so first and foremost, we have the National Ignition Facility. It is the only laboratory on Earth right now where we can achieve burning plasma, and the only one that has achieved fusion ignition. So, target gains greater than 1. And so we absolutely need to continue to use the NIF to develop the science and learn more. Besides that, we also have phenomenal expertise in lasers. The old joke goes that our acronym is LONL, which stands for lasers, nothing but lasers. And so in terms of very high energy, big lasers, that's where Livermore specializes. So we continue to push forward the forefront in different laser architectures, figuring out the technology behind lasers, but a bunch of other stuff too. So I'm a high energy density physicist. We have great expertise there in both generating these high energy density plasmas, diagnosing them, learning from them, and also the simulation codes to go along with them, trying to understand what's actually happening. So the development of those codes, a lot of that is done here. So the codes, are Livermore codes per se. We have the design physicists that can model those plasmas. And besides that, we have great computational scientists. We have one of the fastest supercomputers in the world, and always constantly upgrading to try to push the forefront there. We have great machine learning, artificial intelligence scientists that are developing new techniques for AI applied specifically to science problems, right? And so what that means is there's all kinds of new requirements that come out of new science that's being done, right? That is more than just generate me a picture of a cat playing a guitar, right? It's actually, how can we use AI and machine learning to actually do scientific discovery or accelerate science? We have additive manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, great capabilities here to push the boundaries there of new techniques, new materials that you can additively manufacture, higher resolution, new techniques there. And we work with industry very closely in that arena. We have new diagnostics that we build, many of them in-house. So, for example, the instrumentation that we use on the NIF you don't get to buy off the shelf in many cases because nobody else has use for it. So we build a lot of that in-house, which also means, for that instrumentation, building entirely new detectors, new materials that can detect better or with higher resolution, right? Different types of cameras, different types of materials, a lot of work there. And then also expertise, just running these very big science facilities. That is an art in its own. In order to operate something super complex efficiently and safely. And so I think the figure of merit typically is whatever the cost was, the capital cost was to build that machine, the operating cost for 1 year is about 10% of that original capital cost. So that just gives you an idea of, okay, so you've built something, that's great, right? How do you keep it running? And then with all of these machines, they took a lot of investment. They took a lot of work. You always want to make them better all the time too. So it should already be a piece of machinery that is unique, forefront in the world, but you want to keep pushing that. So that means advancing that technology as well. So, for example, with the NIF, our next big challenge is certainly sustainment because it's 20 years old. Like if you imagine your 20-year-old refrigerator, right? Things are going to start just kind of wearing down because it's running 24/7. But beyond that, pushing up to greater energy, greater powers, right? That means improving the technology. Somehow, in our case, it means optics that can be more hardened, can run at higher energies, upgrading the computer system, right? That actually runs the laser. So all of these little things going in require a lot of investment, a lot of R&D in all of these different areas.
Tammy, of course, the creation of viable nuclear fusion will have profound implications for energy use and climate change mitigation. Is Lawrence Livermore operating under some kind of a sustainability mandate, either from the DOE or the White House, where the one of the main thrusts of achieving this is really as a solution to wean ourselves of fossil fuels?
As far as I know, no, there isn't that kind of mandate that we're working. Some of our climate group, is certainly trying to contribute to the net zero goals that the Biden administration put out, for example. But in terms of fusion, not necessarily. In fact, one of the big reasons that we're going after fusion energy, though, is actually energy security as much as climate security, right? Because fusion is meant to be this clean, we say limitless, like super abundant energy source, right? And if we can manage to do that, that completely changes the paradigm of how we use energy. And it frees the US from a lot of the interrelationships that we have with other countries to ensure that we have a steady energy source. And ideally, it is an energy source, not just for the US, but every country in the world to have its own energy sovereignty, right? To have control over its energy sources. And so from that perspective, we're a national security lab. Energy is a big component of that national security. And so that's a good fraction of the reason why we're so interested in fusion energy.
Now, the creation of limitless or abundant energy has profound business implications as well.
Yeah.
There's many private enterprises that are involved in this, and because it's private enterprise, to some degree, they're involved in a race to who can get there first. How does Lawrence Livermore position itself so that it is assisting private enterprise without necessarily perhaps playing favorites? How does that work?
You did a lot of research there. Yeah, I mean, that is exactly the job of a national lab, right? What we're trying to do is help develop some of the foundational technologies to grow potentially a fusion energy industry, an entirely new energy industry. And it is our job as a national lab to develop technologies, generally for the first time. We do not mass produce, we do not manufacture something after more than once or twice after we develop it. We typically do technology transfer out to private industry. We very often, sign agreements with them to hand over the technology to a private company so they can manufacture whatever it is, and then it can be bought. And sometimes we buy it back from them, in fact, if we need to use that technology. And so right now, you're right, in this fusion ecosystem, lots of private companies popping up. Many of them do come to us to leverage some of the expertise we have here, whether it's in simulation codes or laser development, or executing experiments themselves. And so, what we have to do is make sure that we treat all the companies fairly, unbiasedly. And so with Inertial Fusion Energy, what we did was set up a collaboratory, and I can send you the link to this collaboratory if you're interested. What we did was bring together many of the national labs from across the U.S. And in some cases, university labs as well, that are currently doing work that is related to inertial fusion. Now, keep in mind, Inertial Fusion Energy hasn't been funded in the U.S. In the past 10 years. So it was like inertial confinement fusion work that was related. So we brought them all together so that we could all talk to each other and figure out, who was getting approached by private companies and work out some of these issues. And on the website that we have, we actually list out our capabilities at each of these national labs where we might be interested in partnering. And we held an industry day similar to what DARPA often does. The private companies responded to say, oh, this is what we might be interested in. This is what we need help with. And then as a collaboratory, we could all see that information and then try to figure out who amongst us might be best suited to help these private companies and figure out where the alignment was. Because it's also not our job to, just help whoever comes to ask for help. There needs to be some mutual benefit as well. But certainly it's super exciting to have these private companies that we can now interact with and, maybe try out different ideas, work in a paradigm where they're more agile, maybe more flexible than we are. They're sometimes interested in building new infrastructure that we can benefit from. And so it's a very dynamic place to be right now.
As companies are racing or competing to achieve viable nuclear fusion energy, is there only one way to skin a cat, or are there different approaches to nuclear fusion? And Livermore is responsive to many, or it does things in a particular way and it's only responsive to one particular way of getting there? How does that work?
So there's many different ways to skin this cat. And right now we don't know actually which way has the highest potential or might be the best one in the long run, right? So certainly there is magnetic fusion, where with magnetic fusion, you're using gigantic magnets to hold your plasma long enough that it can fuse. So this is typically tokamaks or stellarators. The ITER project in the south of France is a gigantic tokamak. And then with inertial fusion, that is using lasers, sometimes pulse power or heavy ions to actually basically compress your plasma and use the inertia of the compression to actually hold your plasma in place long enough to give it time to fuse. And even within inertial fusion, there's all kinds of different approaches. There is direct drive, where you could shine lasers directly on a fuel pellet to compress it. What we do on the NIF is indirect drive. So the lasers come in and they hit a cavity, a little cylinder with two holes on either end, and the lasers actually hit the inside wall of that cylinder to create X-rays. We use those X-rays to compress the fuel pellet. There's other designs where you separate the heating and compression stages, something called fast ignition. And so you would still, compress your capsule up to, decent densities, and then you bring in a short pulse, very high intensity laser to generate a beam of energetic particles that then deposit their energy and heat that way. There's other designs called shock ignition. There's magneto-inertial, where you combine magnets and inertial fusion. Many, many different approaches now. And there's also some approaches that even use different fuel for their fusion reaction. Most of our experiments have centered around DT, deuterium, tritium, isotopes of hydrogen, which have the highest cross-section probability for fusion in the temperatures that we can achieve on Earth in a lab. But there's other fuels that you can fuse, D-helium-3, deuterium and helium-3, or p-boron, a proton with a boron atom. And all of them have pros and cons. There's many different potential ideas right now. I think one of the limitations of the field is actually that we don't have enough facilities, because you need a certain scale, a certain size of facility to test a lot of these things in order to see if they're viable.
Tammy, let's now move on to the physics of nuclear fusion. So you've already conveyed wonderfully just how difficult and complex this quest to achieve nuclear fusion is. So in so many areas of physics, the challenge, the really hard part, is getting at the interplay of theory and experiment, right? Will we ever see experimental validation of string theory? Why hasn't CERN seen something beyond the Higgs? Things like that. For nuclear fusion, is the theoretical framework perfectly established, or are there missing items in the theory itself that are giving the experimentalist difficulty?
I think any scientist that says the theory is fully established in any field would not be telling the truth, because there's always more to learn, right? I think so. Certainly, what we do here at Livermore, I guess in the U.S. for nuclear fusion, is very much this interexchange between theory and simulations, and then experimental validation, finding out your experiment was wrong, but taking what you learned there to improve the code, the modeling all over again. There is certainly still a lot of unknowns in our simulations. I mean, certainly the NIF is the ninth in a series of bigger and bigger lasers that we have built here at Livermore. Almost all of them we thought we could achieve ignition with. And so, every time we found out that we did not have enough laser energy until we got to the NIF. And even on the NIF, when we built the NIF, due to constraints of time and budget, right, we knew that the 2 megajoule laser was just on the hairy edge of achieving ignition. Even the codes said this is just on the hairy edge. And I think the last 10 years of experimentation have taught us a lot about how incomplete, some of our understanding was of the physics. And each time we got a little bit closer, each time we increased the performance on the NIF, we found out something new about the implosion that we had not accounted for in the simulations. So for example, early on, we saw that our performance was nowhere. We expected, like, right after we turned on the NIF, we would get ignition. And of course, obviously we didn't. What we found out was, like, early on that we had perturbations from how the capsule is actually held in the hull ROM. So what we do is we build the hull ROM in 2 halves. You put a very thin membrane across the 2 sides and clamp the capsule right in the middle. Now for us, a symmetrical implosion, meaning staying spherical as possible as we do that compression, is super important. Because what we're doing is taking the kinetic energy of implosion and turning that into heat. And if you deviate from round in any way, you're basically wasting your kinetic energy, and all of that energy is so precious. So early on, we would do all these shots, and like we would take X-ray images of the hot spot, and it was never very round. It would be oblate or prolate, or we would see streaks across the hot spot that we didn't understand. It turns out that those membranes that we were using to hold the capsule in the middle caused serious perturbations to the implosion, like right as we were at the beginning, right? And they just grew as we did the compression. And our codes initially, did not model that correctly. And it took quite a while to figure that out. Okay, so we solved that. Great. And then later on, we found each time you solve one problem, it gives you a window to a better implosion, but that reveals other things that perturb. And so I think it's been a really great example, though, of how, having the codes and that experimental validation really had to work hand in hand. And when I give NIF tours, I actually always stop when we get to the windows and point at the supercomputer, halfway across the lab, which is also in a pretty large building, so you can see it. And the point is that, neither of these facilities would exist without each other, right? In order to justify building the supercomputer, we needed this really gnarly physics problem that only a supercomputer could solve. And then likewise, you can't do these experiments without guidance from the codes, because there are 10,000 different physics parameters to change on every shot. And you absolutely have to rely on the simulation codes to guide you.
Tammy, just a fun thought experiment to give a sense of all of the technological leaps and bounds that make all of this possible. So let's say we had a time machine and you could give Enrico Fermi a tour of the lab. What would he understand?
I would want to tour his lab first.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So what would he understand immediately? Where would he see a perfect continuation of his project to build controlled nuclear energy? And what would he look at and it would be incomprehensible to him?
Oh my gosh. I think that the scale and the complexity would be incomprehensible. I mean, fission by comparison is easy. All you have to do is have a critical mass, of your uranium or plutonium, and it'll go. I think on the NIF, you have to have so much precision at every level, right? We know the length of every single electrical cable inside NIF in order to sync up all the instruments with when the shot actually happens. I would think it's something that is very, very difficult to conceive. So even for me, thinking ahead to what the next generation facility would look like, it is evolutionary, not something that looks totally different. To be able to imagine such a big difference from 60 years ago, I can't imagine.
So, of course, the joke, I'm sure you know that nuclear fusion has been, around the corner for 40 years, right? So to go back to December of 2022, when this announcement was made, even before it was made, the Department of Energy, lab leadership, there was a tremendous buildup. It was almost like the DOE version of a major album drop, right? There was so much anticipation. What is the secretary going to say? So the joke about being 40 years around the corner, the joke there is that there's been a lot of hype in this field over the years.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, the DOE lab leadership is aware of this. What made this different? Why did the administration, the Department of Energy, why did it, I don't want to use the word hype here, but why did it make the announcement feel as big as it was? What was different this time around?
So I think hype is something that is, by definition, part of our fusion field. I think people need so much optimism to even work in the field, because it is so incredibly difficult, right? I think everybody has to imagine that, previously it was that we would get ignition during your lifetime, during your career, right? And then I think it's okay. I think, we absolutely have to be able to make fusion power plants within 20, 30 years. Well, people are saying 5 to 10 years now, but whatever, in order to keep themselves going. More to the point of your question, I think it was a super big deal for the Department of Energy because it is an example of a win from sustained investment and sustained support over decades. And in order to achieve nuclear fusion, it wasn't just, put your head down and work really hard. It was something that is incredibly interdisciplinary. And you have to pull in expertise from across the complex. And in fact, those types of needs are what spurred a lot of the competencies that we have within DOE now. So, we already talked about the supercomputers. A lot of the drive behind bringing in supercomputers, developing those supercomputers, was actually to help solve plasma physics problems. And then, likewise, the laser development over time, has been pushed by the fusion needs that we have had. And so and then each of these areas has grown into its own big thing, right? And so that's why, and that's why the DOE has continued to go after fusion, because there's so many amazing spin-offs, spin-outs that come from fusion. A lot of them making, technology possible today. For example, plasma TVs. A lot of the underlying plasma physics work there, to make that technology happen, came through funding this type of research. But then also, I think just the potential, the idea of what fusion can do for humankind. And after all, we are called the Department of Energy. Fusion is the last energy source that we have not really been able to tame. And so that alone, for those of us that are curious and believe in, what humans can actually do, that alone makes you want to go after it, right?
So to go back to this dichotomy that you established, which I love, the revolutionary and evolutionary, the announcement and the research behind it, what aspects do you see as evolutionary that are, this is another brick in the wall of this 40-year endeavor, and what of it is really like, a quantum leap, that it got us way beyond the incremental development over the year that gets us much closer to ultimately where this is headed?
I think for most part, and I think this is true for science, you don't hear, there isn't a lot of science news coming out in the media ever, right? So very often it seems like somebody had a eureka moment,
yeah.
And there was, something totally revolutionary that made something happen. But for the most part, for those of us that do research, right, we know that most of it is evolutionary. We are building on the knowledge base that was there before. And so I think that is actually true for how we got to ignition, for where we are today. But there are huge leaps that make this possible. For example, a lot of the technologies we actually needed to complete construction of the NIF did not actually exist at the time when DOE signed off to say, yeah, let's start this construction project. And so that is just incredibly forward-leaning, and is a huge example of how government itself actually takes really big risks, right? We have this reputation that government is slow, isn't willing to try new things, but it's actually not true. Government is the one that said, yeah, let's go for it, even though we don't have all the solutions yet, and we will find those solutions. And we did. And so there are some examples for how we were able to actually have new optics manufacturing techniques to be able to fill the NIF with, these thousands of gigantic optics that we needed for these lasers that did not exist before. And so, I wouldn't call that necessarily revolutionary in itself, because again, you're taking the knowledge that you have, you're adding huge amounts of innovation, right? But those are just some of the examples of the creativity that can happen when you push it, when something actually has to happen, right? We had a timeline, we had requirements, and only because of those stringent requirements are you pushed to think so creatively to actually make something happen. And so in many cases, I think we often need those boundaries. We often need those timelines in order to spur the creativity for something to happen. And so right now, the government has put out this bold decadal vision for fusion commercialization, right? Mm-hmm. And, it sounds crazy, because there's so much development that needs to be done. But that is the kind of thing that can really put momentum into the system, put pressure into the system for people to think creatively and really innovate to make something happen.
Tammy, since this announcement and your amazing ability to communicate the science and really to be the public face of this breakthrough in so many ways.
One of many.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll get there. So how has your day-to-day changed, both administratively, both in terms of the public outreach and in terms of the science itself?
Yeah, well, Patty knows because Patty helps me manage so much of it. Yeah, there has been a lot of media interest, and it has changed my job structure quite a lot because the excitement that is around fusion right now, we absolutely want to take advantage of it, and we really want to capitalize on it, because it's not so often that the public is really interested in science of any type, right? And so I do a couple of media events probably every week, podcasts, interviews. I've been traveling a lot to give talks as well, both talking about our ignition result and how we achieved that. And certainly we want to, we want Livermore to take credit for that, and then give credit to all the thousands of people that worked on this project over the decades. But then also to lay the foundations for the next step, because we will also need a huge amount of support to realize fusion energy. And I mentioned earlier, we don't have a we just started a national program in inertial fusion energy. And it's not a lot of money right now, so that's going to have to grow significantly if we're serious about it. And so we need support for that, but we also need to change the public perception of nuclear energy. And so we see that it is imperative that we go out and communicate in order to, and it's certainly not enough, but try to make strides in spreading the message, the potential of fusion, but then also hearing the concerns from communities and see what they care about. Because in the end, it's great to do science and have some, fundamental increased understanding of the universe. But if you don't apply it to something useful to humanity, then it's just, and if you don't communicate it, right, then how do you know that science was done, right?
Well, Tammy, let's go back now and establish some personal history. How many generations back do you have a relationship in your family? Did you know your great-grandparents, your grandparents?
No. So I didn't know my grandparents. My grandparents and parents immigrated to my dad's side of the family to the U.S., my mom's side of the family to Canada. And so I only know my grandparents. I don't know farther back from that.
Where did both your mom and dad's parents come from, or their families came from?
Yeah, they came from Guangdong, Canton, South China. Both of my parents immigrated to Hong Kong first before coming over to Canada and the U.S.
What years did they immigrate?
So they were both children. I think my mom was 13 or 14 when she went to Canada, and similarly, my dad was 13 when he came to California. My dad was 69. And then I think my mom she was born in 54, so 78-ish.
Did they have memories from their parents about World War II and the Japanese occupation?
Very much so.
What stories have you heard?
Well, initially, when I was very young, when I was a kid, my parents had said to me, you can marry whoever you want, but you are not allowed to marry Japanese.
Oh, wow.
So that was residual. They've changed quite a lot, and now they don't care at all. But at the time, that was true. Yeah, they do have stories. My uncles on my dad's side have stories about, hearing the planes going overhead and then having to run and hide. Because they were enemy planes. My mom was carried on her grandmother's back, going from China over to Hong Kong. I also have uncles that had to swim across the bay from, oh, I don't know if bay is the right word actually, from China to Hong Kong, and many people did not make it. But they did. And my father's side of the family, oh, maybe you can help me with this. Supposedly, they came to the U.S. as refugees under Kennedy's Refugee Act.
Yeah, yeah.
And I haven't been able to, I've tried to do research and haven't found much information about it, but apparently they let like 5,000 Chinese apply as refugees to come to the U.S. And because my grandpa was an elementary school principal, he was the educated class. And so they were worried about persecution from the communists in the 60s and were able to come to the U.S. under that act. And so a really funny story. My father is the youngest of 7. And so apparently, he only found out a few years ago that he's 2 years older than he thought he was.
Oh, wow.
This whole time. Because like he's the youngest of 7 and they had to like downgrade everybody's age in order to fill out paperwork to get the family over to the US. And all the other brothers knew, except for my dad, because he was too young. And then he only found out recently. So all of his, US paperwork says he was born in 1950. But then only recently, one of my aunts was doing some research about the family. And she was like, no, you were born in 48. And my dad was like, so I just lost 2 years of my life. Like, it's crazy stories like that.
Now, you said your mom's family landed in Canada.
Yeah.
Why Canada? What was the opportunity there? Was there family there already?
Yeah, so my mother's uncle had already gone over to Canada. And so what they did was they sent my mom and her older brother to Canada first without their parents. And it was my mom's job when she was like 13, right, to try to establish the family. And so she actually did not get to finish high school, actually middle school. She did not even get to finish middle school. She got pulled out of school so that she would go work and make money to support the family. But then I guess a few years later, she applied for her mom and her dad, well, her dad first, to actually join them in Canada.
And then where did your parents meet?
My parents met in California. So I think they were introduced through an acquaintance. And so they did the typical thing at the time, which was talk on the telephone, maybe visited once or twice. And then my mom flew over to California to marry my dad.
And where did they settle?
Fremont, California. So that's where I grew up. Yeah, my dad ended up working in Silicon Valley. He was an electrical engineer. And then my mom used to be a fashion designer. So in Canada, she worked on the design floor making clothes. And she recently gifted me a bunch of clothes she had made for herself like 40 years ago, super stylish stuff. But then when she married my dad, she got pregnant with me very soon afterwards. And she stayed as a homemaker, stay-at-home mom.
What level of education did your dad achieve in electrical engineering?
So he got his bachelor's from Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo.
And then what kind of work did he do? What kind of companies did he work for?
He worked for Tandem, which was you know what? I don't actually know what they did at the time. But he was a technician with Tandem for quite a while. And then he moved over to Cisco, bounced around at a bunch of different Silicon Valley companies. Later on, he kind of, they had layoffs when the economy had downturns. That must have been whenever in the 90s, whenever that downturn was, the bubble burst. And then he had kind of aged out, wasn't one of the more agile young people to, work in Silicon Valley anymore. And then he took a job with the Toyota plant that is in Fremont, that has since become the Tesla plant.
Tammy, did his technical abilities rub off on you? Do you think that was
Oh
an
God, no.
influence?
No,
Not at all?
not at all. No, not at all. My mom was actually the one that really loved science, and really held science up to high standard. And so, we would always go to science museums. She'd take me and my brother, anything where we could learn. It was my mom who would take us there. We would talk about science that we heard in the news, and she just had such a reverence for education and for science and smart people, that I think that's actually what rubbed off more.
Growing up, what languages were spoken in your house?
Oh, so the embarrassing thing is I can only speak English. I can understand a little bit of Cantonese, but my parents came at a time where assimilation was super important, right? So they did not try to teach us Chinese. We were not put in Chinese school.
Maybe it was their secret language when they didn't want you to understand, kind of
Yeah,
thing?
yeah. So, I mean, my brother and I can kind of understand some. We can't speak. It's that strange thing. And the other thing was, my mom actually, she wasn't like a tiger mom type of parenting. Chinese school was on Saturday mornings, right? And my mom actually wanted to preserve time for us to play and be kids, right? So my brother and I would watch Saturday morning cartoons instead of going to Chinese school.
So it was a fully assimilated household. There really weren't many cultural customs and things like that.
We didn't follow a lot of Chinese traditions. So we'll celebrate Chinese New Year with the broader family. All of my dad's family is actually pretty close by in California, kind of Stockton, Oakland, this area. My mom's family is still Canada or Louisiana, so also in Northern America. But yeah, so we would get together for family gatherings, but not a lot of Chinese traditions there.
Was your neighborhood growing up, was there like a Chinese American enclave? Was it more diverse?
There are a lot of Chinese Americans in the area. So I went to Mission San Jose High School, which while I was there was probably 50% Asian. And that includes not just Chinese, but, Indian and Japanese and, just the whole Asian area. And I hear now that it's quite a bit higher than even 50% Asian. And so, but it was because Chinese Americans moved there because of the good schools. And, everybody holds education as the most important thing.
In middle school and in high school, would you have considered yourself a nerd in the best possible sense? Did you love math and science? Was that your thing?
I did. I loved science. Math, I actually was never that great at. I was put in Math 8. Is it called Math 8 at Caltech, the remedial math, when you first arrive? And then I almost failed that. So I am not good at math. But I always loved science. And I'm pretty sure that like no matter which field of science I would have ended up in, I probably would have loved it, to be honest.
So who gave you the confidence that a place like Caltech was within range? Who was helpful in that regard?
Oh God. Yeah. So my mom was not familiar with the U.S. Educational system and colleges, right? And so, and I was the oldest child. My brother is younger than me, so we really had no idea how the system worked, or how I actually ranked, how I compared, how competitive I was.
I mean, were you like valedictorian? Did you ace the SATs and all that?
So I was valedictorian. I did well on the SATs, right? I had all kinds of extracurriculars. I did gymnastics and swimming, and of course I play piano, right? Not well. Actually, I don't do any of those things well. But my mom encouraged me to apply? And she goes, just try. And I was like, oh, I'm not going to get in, Mom, right? And she was like, so what? Like, all it costs is the admission enrollment fee, right? When you send in with your application fee, sorry, right? And she was like, that's on me, not on you. So just apply. And so I said, okay, right? And so I did. My dream school up to then had been Stanford, mostly because Stanford was close by, right? And we used to drive over there. They have an excellent mall. And so I didn't get in I applied Stanford early admission and I didn't get in. And so I thought, oh, okay, like, that level of schools, that first tier, right? I'm not going to make it in. But my mom said, just try. And that year, the year that I applied, Caltech was #1 in the Newsweek or US News ranking, like the first time ever. And I actually didn't know of Caltech before then.
Even in Northern California, it's a tiny school no one's heard of.
Yeah, because I didn't know scientists, right? I didn't have exposure to that world.
So like Richard Feynman, Linus Pauling, these were not names that were familiar to you.
Linus Pauling I had known of. Richard Feynman I actually did not, right? As opposed to a lot of the other undergrads coming in. I was just like, who? Yeah. And so my mom encouraged me to apply and I did. And then pre-frosh weekend, at the time, what Caltech would do was, for the females, they would actually pay for your flight to come visit campus. So what they did at the time was they've never lowered the bar for females or minorities ever, right?
Yeah.
For admissions. And but what they would do is after you were admitted, they would make it easier for you to actually come visit. And so because they were willing to pay for my flight, I made the visit to Caltech. Otherwise, my family didn't have a lot of money at that time. So, I felt guilty it wasn't a thing. It wasn't a thing to get on a plane and just go somewhere. And so I visited Caltech. I thought the campus was beautiful. I met other pre-frosh that were great. I liked the small school. And so that's how and the other thing was I did get into MIT. But I had heard at the time that MIT did lower the bar to let more females in so that they had a 50-50 ratio. And I knew that would just eat at me when things got hard. I would not know if I was one of the ones who they had just let in.
That's interesting.
And so even though people had warned me about Caltech being super duper hard, I knew that I deserved to be there. And that made a huge difference in my thinking.
Tammy, what year did you arrive at Caltech?
2001.
2001. So this is 31 years after. Caltech, of course, only starts to admit women in 1970, famously. When you got there, so today it's almost 50-50.
Yeah.
What were the numbers like in 2001? Did you feel was it on the way?
It was 3-1 at that time.
3-1.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's like plenty of women, but it's not half and half. That's how it felt, basically.
Yeah. No, it definitely did not feel half and half. And, many of the guys, we're all kind of nerds at Caltech, not great socially anyway, right? A lot of the boys acted very weird around the girls.
What house were you in?
Fleming House.
Tell me about Fleming House. What kind of experience was that?
It's really very interesting when, you learn about the house process and you're like, okay, whatever, right? Like, it's a dorm, you can live anywhere. And it's not at all like that, right? You show up at Caltech, every house really has its own personality and it finds the right people to be in that house. And it's super cool because I remember going around to these different houses and I was just like, oh, I don't fit in here. Oh, I don't fit in here. And then you rotate into Fleming and you do dinner at that time, right? I don't know. I have no idea what the rotation process is now. And then it just kind of clicks and you're like, oh, these are my people, right? And we have similar interests, similar personalities, and the house just kind of fits the person fits the house. It's kind of cool. It was the athletic house at that time. I don't know if it still is. I found some amazing friends that, definitely still keep in touch with.
Tammy, tell me about that first year curriculum and how it famously beats up on undergraduates.
Oh God. Okay. I cried a lot. So I think the first two terms, right, of freshman year are pass fail. So it's not, you don't even have grades assigned to you. I coming into Caltech, I knew it was going to be hard. I did not worry about having to be the top of the class. That was not something I was too worried about.
I
I
mean, it's
just
a
wanted.
humbling experience, right?
Oh
Everybody's the
God.
valedictorian, so you're nothing special, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I knew that I had made valedictorian not in high school, not because I was particularly smart, but because I worked hard, right? And in high school, that was enough to get by. You study, read the textbook, listen to the teacher, do your homework. And at Caltech, it was a whole different ball game, right? Where just studying is not enough. You really need to truly understand what's going on. And Caltech drills that into you, teaches you actually how from first principles you can actually derive this particular understanding for this piece of science, right? And the other great thing about Caltech was how it teaches you the connections between those different scientific disciplines, which you can only get from truly understanding and not just memorizing a textbook. And so those were all things that started to make a little more sense to me after I was on campus. But the first the entire experience was hard. It wasn't just the first year. You're surrounded by these people that are absolutely brilliant, and they're physics Olympiad, chemistry Olympiad champions internationally. Everybody's done something cool. Some have gone to the Olympics. Some have, built houses or, built their own machines to do whatever. And you're just like, oh, okay. I'm just like middle of the pack here, maybe. And I think it takes, but I mean, it's awesome though. It's so stimulating. And I think for me, I have looked for that in every job afterwards. I seek out the challenges because I'm no longer afraid, right? Caltech teaches you how to think, not just what to think. And so that was really useful. But back to the first two terms, I do remember crying a lot. And then calling my mom, I think second term of freshman year, saying, "Mom, I can't do this. I'm going to transfer." Right. And my mom said,
No
no,
way.
I mean, no. And she said, it's okay. Like if you need to take 5 years, 6 years, that's okay. But if you quit, you are going to regret this for the rest of your life because you're going to think that you can't do things.
Mm-hmm.
And she knows my personality, right? And I was like, I don't want to be here 5 years or 6 years. I want to get out. And she was like, no, just hang in there. You don't have to get great grades. Like that's not important. Just enjoy your time there. And I think what I most enjoyed about Caltech though was the breadth of different things you get to do because it's such a small school. So I was on the swim team. There is no other college in the U.S. that would let me on their swim team. I can guarantee you that, right? I am not a great swimmer. And I got to be the editor for the California Tech, the undergrad newspaper, walk into the dean's office when I needed to, when I had a problem, interact at all levels with the, different professors, students. It was awesome.
Tell me about deciding what course of study you'd focus on.
So actually one of the reasons I picked Caltech was because I wanted to be an aerospace engineer. And during pre-fresh weekend, we got to go over to JPL and visit the JPL campus. And I saw the duplicate of the Mars rover. And, they show you mission control. And I was just like, oh my God, like just to be in the vicinity of this, amazing stuff that's happening Um, and I wanted to be an aerospace engineer, right? So you can't really, there's really no place better if you want to do that kind of stuff.
Who were some of the professors that you really remember that you learned a lot from?
I don't know if I remember their names, quite honestly. Um,
What were some of your favorite classes?
well, let me, John Paul Ravel,
Ah,
who was dean at the time, and I didn't take classes from him because I wasn't a bio major, but I remember how kind he was to the students and how he treated us as equals. Because I did a lot of not student government, but like leadership things where I was in touch with him. Um, and that is something I try to propagate now to the students I work with. And then also Hall Daly, who I don't know if he actually, I don't know what he taught. He was our advisor for the California Tech. Um, but it's not, it's not easy being a Caltech and not being a science
sure.
professor, right? And not science being your thing all the time. But Hall had a way of helping us to kind of see beyond Caltech, because while you're there, it's this lovely little bubble, right? And it's wonderful. It's wonderful. But Hall, because he was our journalism advisor, was able to help us to connect things going on campus to the outside world and help me to see what it means to do science and have impact outside. And also not take things too seriously as well, because there were a couple times where I got very, very upset because some student had done something stupid. And Hall helped me to put a better perspective on just life in general.
Tammy, what did you do during the summers? Did you have surf fellowships? Did you go back home?
No, I did surf. So I absolutely took advantage of that. For the three surfs that I did, freshman year, after sophomore, after junior year, I did all of them at JPL. The first year was in astrobiology because I did not have enough engineering or physics expertise yet to do some of the other aerospace stuff I wanted to do. And so my project was at JPL to look at contamination of space with earthbound human bacteria, and how do we prevent that on our spacecraft that we send into space. And I'm still in touch with those surf advisors at the time. And then my second two surfs were on plasma thrusters. And that's what got me into plasma physics, in fact.
Okay. I was going to ask. So tell me about the
Yeah.
plasma thrusters, why that was so formative for you.
So I worked on a team that was developing these plasma thrusters for deep space missions. So the idea with plasma thrusters is, they ionize a gas to generate a plasma, and the amount of force they create is equivalent to a piece of paper on your hand. So just tiny. But for these deep space missions over very, very long space scales, right? You can accelerate up quite significantly. And so during my summers there, the first summer I was trying to build, I think the first summer was to help build kind of an experimental apparatus that would move a Hall thruster around systematically so that we could measure its output. And then the second year was actually to make those systematic measurements of what the plasma flow looked like. And I think that's mostly what it was. It was just super fun, right? It seemed like play, not work at all. And I met some really great people, again, that I still keep in touch with now. And when it came time to apply to grad school, they ask you to write a statement on, like, what are you really interested in? What do you want to do, right? And you only know so much as you've experienced,
Sure.
really.
Sure.
And so for me, I was like, all right, let's do plasmas because I have a tiny bit of experience there. And so that's how I ended up in this field.
Tammy, how much physics did you have as an undergraduate? I'm just thinking, how much did you have to catch up in graduate school?
Just the standard core curriculum at Tech. Nothing beyond that. But turns out it was more than sufficient to
Uh-huh.
prepare me for grad school. And I took a lot of physics in grad school. Most of my courses, so I was in the mechanical and aerospace engineering department at UCSD for grad school, but most of my courses were in the physics department. I did just fine.
So your degree is not in plasma physics, it's in aerospace engineering.
Yeah, even my PhD is aerospace
Oh,
engineering.
fascinating. And is that unique? I mean, having the plasma physics background in aerospace engineering, is that a common combination of disciplines?
Actually, yeah, in plasma physics, there are very few like pure plasma physics degrees that people have. And for everybody I've talked to in the field, their courses are kind of piecemeal from electrical engineering, nuclear engineering, plasma physics, um, yeah, mechanical, all kind of brought together. So we have people with all different types of backgrounds.
What kind of advice did you get, or how did you know where to apply for graduate programs?
At the time, actually, when I was about to graduate Caltech was when SpaceX was being
Hmm.
kicked off.
Uh-huh.
And Elon Musk hired a lot of Caltech people at
Uh-huh.
that time. So for me, I was like, well, I want to do aerospace. This is a space company, I could just take a job there. And it was only because my friends were all applying to grad school at the time. And I didn't really know what grad school was actually. But I figured it would be easier to just stay in school now and get it done rather than go work for a while and then maybe do a PhD. And so that's why I applied. And um, I just kind of looked at schools that had aerospace programs that were interesting.
So this was not a go to graduate school and become a professor kind of thing for you.
No, it never was. I'm not sure I've ever really wanted to be a professor.
Tell me about
Teaching,
arriving.
teaching, teaching's not my forte.
Tell me about arriving at UC San Diego. What was that like?
Oh, it was overwhelming in a way to go from a school that has 2,000 students total to a school with 25,000, and I felt a little bit lost.
Mhm.
And at Caltech, we're kind of half and half undergrad and graduate students, right? So the emphasis on research and the emphasis on kind of graduate level work is very, very strong at Caltech, probably stronger there than anywhere else that I know of. Whereas at UCSD, right, it's the undergrads, 20,000 undergrads, 5,000 grad students at the time. Grad students are just in the noise, right? Nobody really cares about them. And, I would walk through the student quad and all of the sororities, frats and sororities, right, would like hand me flyers because I looked young at the time, right, to try to join it. I was like, no, 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 no. And it was it was actually quite a tough transition for me, and I don't think I actually particularly enjoyed my year in San Diego. Soon after that, I came up to Livermore actually to do research because we didn't have a laser in San Diego.
So you only did 1 year at San Diego before coming up to Livermore?
I compressed my classes into a year um, so that I could then focus on research full time. And it wasn't that many courses. I think it was like 10 or 12 required classes that you had to do for your almost basically your master's, I think. And so that's, 3 or 4 classes a term. And everybody was like, no, you can't do that. That's too many. And I was like, yeah, but at Tech, everybody does 5 or 6 or 7 a term. I got this. And so I think Tech actually prepared me really well for grad school because you get beat down at Caltech year one, right? And you don't expect to be the smartest, and you also know that grades are not necessarily the most important thing, right? It's how you can perform in the lab and what ideas you can bring. And so in grad school, I didn't stress about classes and grades at all.
So in taking this compressed schedule and figuring out where you could go, How did you learn about the program at Livermore? Did they have an arrangement with UC? How did
Mm.
that work?
Yeah, no. My professor, Farhat Beg at UCSD, when I visited with him, right? So you get into the school, and then, I spent a day kind of visiting different professors to try to get a better feel of the school, what types of research there might be. Farhat had said to me, I collaborate strongly with Lawrence Livermore, and, my group does experiments up there. And if you want, we can send you up there. And I was like, all right, done. Cause that's where I wanted to be. Cause I had worked at the lab between high school and college, the summer of 2001, summer of
Oh,
9/11,
oh,
the summer of
wow.
9/11, I worked at the lab. So, and I loved it, and I loved the people, and I loved the atmosphere. But what was funny was at the time, so this is between high school and college, I didn't have my own car yet. My mom would actually drop me off at work every day, and she could drive into a part of the lab and drop me off in front of my office. 9/11 happened, and the next day when she drove me to work, there were guys with machine guns like standing at the gates. And then since then, things
Yeah,
have changed.
right, right. Tell me about Farhad's research.
So Farhat does all different types of fusion plasma physics. He has a large portion of his group that does laser experiments. Then he also has a little lab on campus where he does pinch physics. So what you do there is you have very thin wires in different configurations, and you can send electrical currents down there. And then because of an instability, those wires will always pinch. You send a current through, you drive a magnetic field, and then the wire actually pinches. And when it does so, you create copious X-rays, sometimes other particles too. And you can study plasmas that way. What Farhad actually does is all types of different plasma physics in the regime of high energy. We call it high energy density, right? So very high densities, temperatures, pressures.
What was the initial project at Livermore from coming from San Diego?
What was the initial project? I think I mean, I started doing work related to my thesis from the very beginning. So it was looking at lasers interacting with solids. So if you have these very, very intense lasers, we call them short pulse lasers. And what they can actually do is they are, if you take all the light from the sun and you concentrate it into a centimeter squared, the lasers that we use are 1,000 times more intense than that. And so what you can actually do is in the laser field, the photons, are wiggling. They can directly liberate electrons from the atoms of so if you're hitting a solid target, it can be copper, titanium, whatever. The laser is actually strong enough coming in that it can wiggle the electrons directly in that solid. And so you can generate beams of particles. Those electrons will start following the laser. And you can get beams of electrons or beams of protons. And so my work from the very beginning was to look at the electron transport that you get, how those electrons move from this type of laser interaction.
Now, what was the arrangement administratively? Was this like a pre-doc? Were you just at Livermore as a UCSD student? How did that work?
Um, so Farhad is very generous with his students. He really wants the best for his students, and he's not possessive of us to like do exactly what he wants. And so it was initially I was just Livermore has a class where we have visiting scientists where we can bring in professors, and they can get a badge and work with us. I think for students, there's something called there's an academic level for that. And so I got to sit at Livermore, and the UC still paid for me. Farhad paid for me. About 2 years in, I got a Livermore graduate fellowship, scholarship, that actually paid my tuition and my salary.
What do you see as the primary conclusions of your thesis? What did you learn? What did the field learn?
So what my field learned was the application for this work was actually a fusion approach called fast ignition. We talked about this at the very beginning,
Mm-hmm.
where you can separate the compression and the heating. So these electron beams that we were generating could be used as the heating source. What we found was that the generation of these electrons is very, very dependent on a laser characteristic called the pre-pulse. So a super energetic laser pulse won't just come in a chunk. Stuff will leak out beforehand just through how it gets amplified. And that's called the pre-pulse. And the pre-pulse is energetic enough that it actually creates a plasma before your laser actually comes in. And that pre-pulse has significant implications for both the absorption physics and how those electrons are generated. So the bulk of my thesis work was to quantify the effects of this pre-pulse on electron generation.
Now, did you maintain an apartment at UC San Diego, or did you just move your entire life to Livermore and you just went back to defend?
Well, so the first year I was in San Diego full time, so I had an apartment. The second year, my best friend still stayed in, she was my roommate my first year. And then the second year, she was still in San Diego working at Johnson and Johnson. And she moved in with a group of other girls. And whenever I was in San Diego, I would just stay with them. But everything else, I actually moved back to my parents' house in Fremont, which is just over the hill from Livermore.
Super convenient.
Yeah, but at that time, you value your independence more,
For sure.
Probably,
For sure.
right? But it was convenient because I was kind of traveling back and forth.
Now, when did all of the research sort of translate into interest, both from you and the lab, of having a career there?
Oh, immediately. Even after my high school internship, I really liked national labs, and I thought it was a good combination of doing science that has impact, but not necessarily commercial science as in industry, right?
Right.
The bottom line for us is, doing the good science. I saw industry as, in many cases, the bottom line is trying to make money, right? And if you're lucky enough, you can also do great R&D, great science. But for me, a big motivator is mission. And I really liked the idea, the mission space of, doing something of value for the country.
In your first job as an employee, how closely related or not was that to what you were doing as a graduate student?
It was pretty closely related. So the NIF was being constructed, the entire time. In fact, when I was here in high school, I actually got to walk underneath the NIF target chamber because they had to put in the chamber first and then build the building around it. And the summer I was here, they had just put in the target chamber. So I got to walk underneath. And they had explained it to me, and I did not understand at all, right? Like what they were talking about. I just knew it was big science. And so straight out of graduate school, it was a very good skill set to bring into the NIF project. And so I came in doing a couple of different areas of research. Oh, because initially they did not allow postdocs to work on the NIF yet because it's such a complex machine. There's still a lot of unknowns at that time for how to do experiments and how to operate effectively. We didn't want postdocs involved yet. I was the very first postdoc to do NIF experiments. I had always, the whole time I was telling my supervisor, my boss, I was like, I want to be on NIF. I want to do NIF experiments. Like, put me on. And so I always knew. But the work that I was doing anyway, the projects I was working on were very related, just plasma physics type fundamental science stuff.
Now, did they make an exception for you, or did they change the rule and thereafter postdocs were allowed to use NIF?
What happened was we realized how big a project it was and we needed people. Mm-hmm. And so they agreed to train me up to actually do NIF experiments. And the very first time I ran a NIF experiment, At the time, most of the shots happened overnight. We would all day be prepping for the experiment, like switching diagnostics in and out, getting the target ready, people like tons of people running around. And then at night, when you actually fire the laser, it's not as intensive. You actually don't need as many people there. So we would do our experiments at night. So I was there in the middle of the night, and I had shadowed a bunch of more senior scientists, evenings previous. And then one of the evenings, they were like, all right, Tammy, we're going to leave you. Call us if anything goes wrong, right? And so I walk into the control room, and I'm like a total idiot. I'm like, hey, guys, what's up? And they're super serious. They run it like a submarine control room, right? They take things seriously. and the shot director in charge was just like, I don't know who you are. Get out. So they had to throw me back out, and I had to call my mentors and be like, sorry, I do need you to come back in.
Tammy, to go back to that idea that it's not, private enterprise, but it's science with impact. In the early years when you joined officially, what was the rough balance between fundamental research and really, thinking about applications? How did that work? Is it all rolled into one? Do you have separate aspects of the day? It is all rolled into one,
and I don't think it's actually changed so much.
Uh-huh.
We're very aware that the work that we do is quite fundamental. Every experiment is a little bit different, and we publish in academic journals most of what we do, actually. And the application space is developing. For example, developing a neutron source that is, super bright that you can use for testing of weapons, or not testing weapons, testing of, materials degradation or something like that. I would say all of it is both very fundamental and very application driven. We do care very much. We very rarely do something just to make it work. Right? We will do the physics modeling to understand the underlying physics of how some mechanism actually goes. So I don't quite know how to answer your question.
No, it sounds like it's all rolled into one. It's a very unique approach. It's not one or the other is what it is.
Yeah.
Tammy, is all of your research at the lab, is it all sort of, I don't know if mission is the right word, but are you ever allowed or able to do your own thing? Like if you have like a professor, they're interested in this and they want to go off and do that. Is there opportunity to explore that aspect?
Yeah, very much so, actually. And so kind of curiosity-driven research is a big component also of what we do, because we know a lot of innovation comes out there. So we are actually mandated by Congress, the national labs are within the DOE complex, to take some of the money that comes into the laboratory and turn it around into internal funding for competitive proposals internally. And we call it Laboratory Directed Research and Development, LDRD. And it's 6.5% or 6%. It might be 6% actually. 6% of the money that is brought into the lab goes into the LDRD program. And we annually have a cycle where we apply for funds for crazy ideas. Or, occasionally the lab will say, oh, we'll solicit proposals in this area or this area. And so last year we did solicit proposals in inertial fusion energy. And LDRD brings in a whole bunch of great ideas. It's a huge recruitment tool for us at the lab, and creates a lot of patents and publications. And I love the program so much that I actually served as the deputy director for LDRD 2 years ago. Yeah. I did that for only a year though, because then inertial fusion energy started picking up, and I moved over kind of to concentrate on that.
Tammy, you have such a neat, unique perspective of seeing the NIF being built to where we are today. Where in the narrative, to sort of like, you put that December 2022 announcement and what it means. When in the narrative of your time at the lab did it feel like this was happening, that it was headed in this direction? Is that really like day one, or does it happen like in 2016? Is there like a paradigm shift? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I think December actually caught a lot of us by surprise. I always expected that we could achieve ignition on the NIF, but it had been such a long time since we started the project that, and we're shooting every day, right? And you stop thinking, oh, this will be the one, this will be the one. But one thing that Caltech trained me well in was to accept failure or look for failure even, right? We're because you start doing research so early, you're actually in the lab, you get a very good feeling of how arduous research can be, how slow it is, right? At the same time, you are learning from every single experiment. There is no failed experiment, right? Unless you actually wasted resources and learned nothing, right? That might be a failed experiment. But otherwise, you're always learning something. And so for me, it was, it was not like I ever got discouraged working on the NIF, because we were always doing something cool and something new. But that being said, so I was working full time on the ignition campaign, the ignition project on the NIF, from basically when I started as a postdoc till 2018. And around 2018, I actually stepped away to start working on fusion energy. And at that time, it was more like kind of building, we weren't allowed to say the words energy for quite a while, actually, because after we weren't able to get ignition after a couple of years, our funding agency, the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, said to us, hey guys, like the energy stuff is a distraction. We want you to focus on stockpile stewardship, right? And so we actually were not allowed to talk about energy for a while. But then around 2018, one of the NIF director at the time, Mark Herman, and I started kind of going out in the community and trying to build up support again for fusion energy, starting to feel the waters. We participated in a lot of kind of DOE workshops and reports to start injecting the idea of IFE back in there. And it was the idea that, hey, we may actually get ignition someday, maybe someday soon on NIF. We have to be ready for the next steps. And if we don't get ignition, then what is Livermore's backup plan as well, right? And so in that sense, I also started doing, and my group right now actually works on what we call high repetition rate, HED. So the NIF shoots once every 4 hours, 8 hours. New lasers today can shoot at 10 hertz, 10 times a second. And so you have to change how you do experiments, right? And then you start incorporating ideas of big data, bring in machine learning. That is where our field is headed. And so my group is trying to bring up the capabilities to actually take advantage of these new lasers. And so, it was both, okay, we don't get ignition. Well, okay, we have to bring up high rep rate no matter what anyways. And then, if we get ignition, we have to be ready to push energy, because that's what the world is going to care about. No, but they don't actually care about stockpile stewardship, right? We have to know how to answer the questions. We have to lay out the roadmap. And what I've learned over the past couple of years is how much impact each scientist, I'll keep it to science, each scientist can actually have in the overall ecosystem, right? It seems like, the government decides, what science to fund and how much money to put in. But really that input comes from scientists, down working in the field, right? It is what we advise the government on and how we want to push things that really drives how things actually happen.
Tammy, this idea about not being allowed to talk about energy, I'm curious, you've been at Livermore now long enough where you've seen presidents come and go and secretaries of energy come and go. The shifting political winds in Washington, Do you feel that at your level? Is that a factor in how things operate, what budgets look like, what science can be done?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so it was worrisome when Trump took office, right? Because he doesn't hold science in the highest regard, and we did see science budgets shrink in the U.S., and that has major implications for us at Livermore. Um, um, Oddly enough, okay, not oddly, but um, he actually had a fondness for the weapons complex and nuclear weapons. So we actually did see our budgets grow in that area quite significantly in terms of modernizing our weapons stockpile and a lot of work there. Um, but yeah, with every administration change, and actually constantly with the churn that you have in Washington, right? Part of our job is not just to do good science, but to communicate that science and also influence, how we spend, our funds in the U.S. to ensure national security and competitiveness in all of these different scientific realms. And so, we have, my job certainly, and the job of quite a few scientists here at Livermore is to constantly go to DC, right, and talk to our lawmakers so that they understand, both the pros and cons, the dual use nature of our different technologies. If we're trying to push AI, like how can we really use AI to push forward all of these different areas, bio and looking at developing new proteins, developing, the COVID vaccines, right? And how can we use the resources within the National Lab Complex to solve urgent problems like COVID, for example. And so it's, for me, a lot of my job is advocacy now, which doesn't just, it happens constantly because every year a new budget is put together, right? And you have to make sure things stay funded. And then also, each time an administration changes, there's huge differences in priorities for that administration that we need to try to influence.
Tammy, when you joined the Ignition effort into 2018, how well developed was it? Or was that really you joining was part of really staffing up and getting much more sustained interest in this?
Yeah, no, I was incredibly lucky because we had gone through a downturn just beforehand. And when I graduated, we realized we needed to staff up again to actually run the Ignition project. Sorry, what was your question was more specific than that?
No, just that when you joined, how much can we read into just a new direction in 2018, where the lab wanted to go?
Oh, in 2018. Oh, when I joined the energy effort.
Yes.
I think so we had been a small team of us had been since kind of 2018 kind of developing the foundations for fusion energy again, inertial fusion energy again. And after Ignition was achieved, it brought a lot more attention, a lot more momentum into the system, for sure. I think I'll have to get back to you in a few years. We right now do have a lot of support to make to grow fusion energy as a program. And so I think, yes, that is a new direction. Whether or not it grows into a sustained R&D program depends very much on how successful we can be in getting federal public funding. Right now, the private companies are certainly bringing money into the system, and we do contracts with them, right, to work with them. But private companies generally kind of come and go, right? You need sustained government investment for something as challenging as fusion, and so we'll see if we can make that happen. And if we're successful, then yes, I would say it's a new direction.
There you go. Tammy, moving our conversation closer to the present, when COVID hit, you can't do Ignition by Zoom. What did that mean for the lab? what got halted, what levels of automation were possible that things could keep up more or less as they were.
Yeah. Not only can you not do ignition and experiments by Zoom, a lot of the classified work that happens
Right.
here at the lab has to be done in person in protected areas. And so the lab is very, very good at dealing with crises in a way that is actually empathetic and understanding as well. And so our lab leadership was fabulous. They communicated well the entire time. They tracked, we're a science lab, and people generally believe the science. So we could track the COVID rates and make decisions, following that on how to stay safe, and at the same time bring people back to the lab. And so I think maybe just a week or two after COVID started, they found ways to keep the different facilities running that had to be running, and certainly the NIF. And so they found ways to bring essential people back on site safely. Of course, everybody stayed masked. They put all kinds of the plastic shielding up at the time was what everybody was doing. Figured out how to stagger the workforce. But we were back to running shots. I don't know the exact date, but within 2 weeks of COVID happening, and a lot of things can be done remotely, and so we expanded that where we could, and then only had essential staff on site. But we really did not lose too much productivity in that area.
Tammy, I wonder if you can explain. So, the notion of achieving ignition. So, I can imagine how a Hollywood director would portray this. It's like JPL,
How?
JPL mission control, the rover lands, everybody is high-fiving and jumping up and down.
Yeah.
Is there a dramatic moment like that, or it's much more incremental and, looking at the computers and making sure that the numbers make sense? I wonder if you could narrate that process.
It's much more incremental. It's funny because when I was running experiments on the NIF, like I mentioned to you, we would do those shots overnight. So for many of my shots, they actually sent a film crew in there with me to film, because that shot was going to achieve ignition. And
meaning they recognize the historic nature of this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, right. And the shots take quite a long time. They're faster now, but back in the day, they definitely took, 6-8 hours more to actually execute. And so we would just be sitting in, the conference room. It's like 3-4 a.m. in the morning, and I would fall asleep. And then the guy behind the camera would fall asleep. And then after we did this like 3 or 4 times, the camera guy was like, you know what? Like, we're going to get ignition anytime soon. And like every time it looks the same. It's just me sitting in front of a computer. And when the shot goes off, then kind of the online dashboard basically starts to propagate as data flows in from all the different diagnostic instruments. And you're just hitting refresh as fast as possible to try to get more numbers to come in. But it's actually kind of anticlimactic because it's so well run. You hear the capacitor banks fire to release the energy into the laser, but you don't actually hear the shot itself. And so all you hear is over the radio, the shot director doing the shot countdown, and then he's like, yep, shot completed.
So then what's the moment of confirmation? There has to be like some moment where you figure out this is the real deal.
Yeah, the moment of confirmation comes with all of the data streaming in, and then we have, many different detectors, diagnostics, for example, reporting the neutron yield. It's not just one single measurement. And so things do get scrubbed, though, manually by humans, going back over the data to check on the error bars and such. So from what I hear on that big shot day, the shot physicist, the responsible physicist at the time, he was at home watching the dashboard and the numbers propagate. And he got excited because he saw big numbers. And so he started calling some of the other physicists, waking them up, and then everybody got up to try to check. And then over the next week, actually, it takes about that long for some of the numbers to actually come in, because some of our most accurate measurements are activation detectors. It's really pieces of metal, right, stuck around the chamber that activate when the neutrons hit them, and then you stick them in a counter and you watch them decay. And from that decay rate, you can reconstruct a very accurate initial number. But that decay takes time. And so that's why it takes us a little while to check those numbers.
Tammy, just as a frame of reference, if you've been following at Fermilab, there's a lot of excitement over these wobbling muons, and this might break us beyond the standard model, but it's so nuanced. It's like a sigma 7, and they're bringing in theorists, and it's going to take a year. So how exact is the confirmation? I mean, how careful? Obviously, the stakes are big from a PR perspective, but how nuanced is the did we or did we not achieve ignition? How easy is that binary to establish?
In this case, for the ignition shot last December, it didn't need to be that nuanced because we generated so much more above the ignition threshold, 50% more, that we weren't even close to the boundary. But that being said, we have not published the paper yet out of that December shot, because we are still working through not just the neutron yield numbers, but making sure all the other data correlate to that. The 2D X-ray images that we get, there's a certain brightness of X-rays that's correlated to the temperature and density of your plasma, which should match the yield that you got. And everything should make sense in that way, right? All fit together. And so we're still working on some of that.
So what was the thinking that the announcement was ready to go out, but the paper is still in production? How do you measure those confirmations?
That was a big debate, because for us, we have been in the fusion field, particularly, we have been dinged many times, right, by people hyping things up that are not true. And in many of our previous announcements, we did not make the announcements, and for other milestones along the way, right? We did not make the announcement until the papers came out. But in this case, we knew that if we did not do a press, I mean, this is such a big breakthrough, and we were so much beyond what we knew we had to hit for ignition. There was no doubt that we had done it, that we were confident in doing that press conference. There was no way that we could, analyze the data or fiddle with the interpretation in a way that made us unsure. We knew.
Now, I know you're going to preempt me here and say that there's so many people involved in making this happen. I totally get that. And yet the objective reality is, from a public communication perspective, you are doing so many of the interviews and all of that. Sort of, were you already involved in public communication up to that point? Were you the obvious person to do this just based on the science and your position? What was the decision making in that regard?
Good question. And I ask myself that all the time.
I mean, also, like, as a woman of Asian descent, is there inspiration to lean into in that regard also?
Yeah, nobody's actually ever said that out loud before, but I'm sure that plays into figuring out who should deliver the message. In large part, I have been doing a lot of science communications my entire career. I've taken it very seriously at all levels, right? I go and speak at elementary schools and do public lectures. And so I've had a lot of training in that sense. I give NIF tours, a lot of NIF tours. And so that is, it's a form of service, but it also teaches me to know how to talk about the facility and teaches me how to communicate to different audiences. And I also, in recent years, because of how involved I've been in policy, talk to a lot of the VIP visitors that we have to the lab, whether they're, ambassadors or members of Congress coming, whatever. And that, I think that trained me to do a lot of this communications. I think I'm also just incredibly passionate and excited still, to talk about all of this. And that's important in connecting with the public.
Well, Tammy,
so
now that we've worked right up to the present, for the last part of our talk, I'd like to ask a retrospective question, and then we'll end looking to the future. So
okay.
I don't want to burden you with all of the ways that you've been recognized and honored in your career, but I do want to ask if there have been any awards or professional memberships that have been scientifically useful to you, that being recognized in this way is actually good for the science in terms of both your own research and making the field inclusive and making people inspired to become a part of it. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah. And so I think in general, the awards for me have been most useful in giving me breath and giving me the confidence to know that it makes me less afraid to ask questions, basically, right? It gives me the confidence to know that I fit in, I belong, and so, and people see that the work I do has value, so therefore I can be the one to ask questions, ask stupid questions, and that helps, other early career people in the room, students with us to see that, oh yeah, it's okay, and to help them make room as well for themselves. And so in that sense, all of the awards have been super helpful for that. The award that I won, I think it was 2016, the American Physical Society STIX Award. So it's the Early Career Award. And that came from our APS, right? Our professional society for scientific work. And that was quantifying the level of hydrodynamic mix that we had inside our ignition implosions, or implosions that had not achieved ignition yet, right? That basically, through that work, we were able to establish one of the key mechanisms for our lack of performance on the NIF for quite a long time. And that one means a lot because it is for scientific accomplishment. Many of my awards are more for leadership or communication, which, is wonderful, right? And I'm very thankful. But, you train your whole life to be a scientist. And then also as a woman, you always worry that I'm doing media and I've been picked to do this because I'm a woman.
It's like the MIT concern.
Yeah, you still get plagued by that, right? And so to be recognized for a piece of scientific work means a lot.
All right, so this question is going to be one like for the history books, that when nuclear fusion is achieved in however many years, this is like exactly where we are now. So to put a reality check on the phenomenal breakthrough that is achieving ignition, where is that relative to what actually needs to be created so that this becomes a major part of our energy infrastructure? How do we conceptualize that? Where we are now versus we have this limitless abundant energy and we can use it for everything, and this is where we are. Where are we now relative to that ultimate goal?
So, you've heard the analogy of the Wright brothers moment being used, right? And I actually think that one is really quite apt, because the Wright brothers, the first flight that they made, right, that moment of lifting off the ground is it's ignition. And at the time, there's no way they could have imagined that they would open up an entirely new transportation sector, entirely revolutionize the way people live, right? And the other analogy that I like to use is just 54 years after the Wright brothers demonstrated flight, Boeing launched their first commercial passenger flight.
Yeah.
Right? Just 54 years. The Boeing 707 and the wingspan of that 707 is longer than the entire Wright brothers flight. And so, you think, oh, wow, well, that's really fast, just 54 years. That's within, a typical lifetime. Maybe it's, half a lifetime, 3/4 of a person's lifetime. But so in order to make that happen, they needed advances in so much more than the theoretical understanding of how flight works, right? You needed engineering, you needed new materials to build that airplane. You needed to build up infrastructure and government regulation, right, for this industry. And that's where I see fusion now as well. You have to advance so many different technologies to make this all come together. And all of those technologies alone can't do it. It has to be built on a particular moment in time and advances in all of these different sectors as well, right? Coming together. Like it wouldn't have helped if the Wright brothers had demonstrated flight 100 years earlier, because we didn't have the techniques to, weld steel together or whatever to make that happen. And so, I think we are at that point for fusion right now. Hopefully we can use ignition to help spur, some of these other technologies as well. And that 54-year time frame that I just described for flight kind of seems like the right order of magnitude, right, to make fusion happen too.
Tammy, I won't ask you to predict the future, but if you can provide perspective. So on these debates, we'll get there in 5 to 10 years. We'll get there in 20 to 30 years. What explains that range, of informed people who know what they're talking about? Is it just different levels of optimism? Are they using different metrics? How do you understand this debate?
Sure. When you hear the 5 to 10 year time frame, that is incredibly fast. And that timeline usually comes out of the mouths of private startup companies who have to respond to VC funding,
right,
and are still trying to fundraise. And so they have to be overly optimistic and promise a return on investment in a relatively short time frame. Those of us that have been in the field a little bit longer have actually done real experiments at scale. I think we're a little more tempered in our predictions. But it really depends on the level of investment and support and will, right? So if the US said, we really want to get serious about fusion energy, let's do a Manhattan Project type concentration of expertise and where we're going to focus on. I think we could do it in as fast as 10 years, but more likely it'll be longer than that, simply because we're trying to build up the funding and support. It's really not there right now. It's just not enough to make you're in all science, right? Your progress is directly related to funding, really. Sure. But also each of these different technologies requires quite a bit more maturing. And so it will take time, but we can do it all in parallel. So that's okay. We can make a lot of progress, but it'll probably be at least 10 years, more likely 2 or more decades.
Finally, Tammy, for you, last question, looking to the future, 5, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, where do you want to be as all of these things develop? And is there an increasing administrative or even a policy role if there needs to be this national push for more funding? How do you see yourself contributing?
Well, certainly, in probably the next few years, really getting a robust IFE program off the ground for both the U.S. and Livermore. And we're actually seeing a lot of interest internationally as well. So, helping other countries and other governments to grow their IFE sector, we're very open to, we need the help, right? Longer term beyond that, I have no idea. I have never had a 5-year plan.
Sure.
I've never had a particular position that I wanted to hit. There was always new challenges, new exciting things to do at every step of the way. And I just, at every point, just made the decision for what seemed the most fun at that moment in time. And that's what got me here.
Well, it served you well so far, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Tammy, I want to
Exactly.
thank you for spending this time with me. It's been an awesome conversation. You're a huge point of pride at Caltech, so I just want
Oh,
to thank
thank
you so
you.
much.